The last 18 months have been quite tumultuous, Neville. We've seen the COVID-19 pandemic wreaking havoc across the globe. What has this done for African currency valuations in general?
Well, it's interesting because as we went into the pandemic, currencies were generally overvalued, so by approximately 50%. Of course, the margin differs from country to country, but on average about 50%. So with the COVID pandemic, as you saw, currency volatility ensued, and a lot of African currencies were actually weaker because the US dollar was obviously getting stronger, demand for safe haven currencies, etc. So initially, that was actually quite good for currency overvaluations, getting a little bit better. But as we saw late in 2020 and beginning of 2021, currency started to actually recover. So that exacerbated the overvaluation. So as we stand here in 2021, when we ran, of course, the numbers, we actually saw a little bit of an increase in overvaluation this year relative to 2020. So that's obviously a cause for concern in terms of currency risks and valuations, etc. But that's what the pandemic actually brought to us: a lot of volatility and ultimately overvaluation of currencies.
Speaking of volatility, commodity prices such as oil took quite a hit due to the pandemic. What has this done for currencies such as the Angolan kwanza and the Nigerian naira, which are very highly dependent on oil prices?
Well, it's a tale of two stories in this particular instance. So in the case of Angola, we saw the currency, or at least the authorities allowed for the currency to weaken, to obviously act as a shock absorber. And ordinarily, that's what you should be able to see at a time where oil prices are low, as we saw in the first half of 2020. On the other end of the spectrum, we saw, the Nigerian naira basically remaining flat, regardless of the fact that oil prices were low right at the onset of the pandemic. And that in itself allowed for the Nigerian naira to be extremely overvalued. So it's actually increased on a year-on-year basis in terms of its level of overvaluation. Of course, now they are at a point where they're starting to obviously depreciate the naira little by little in order to try and close that void between where it should be versus where it is at the moment. And of course, less pressure on the Angolan kwanza simply because they took that hit right at the onset of the pandemic. So by and large, those two currencies are a little bit more overvalued, but more so in Nigeria than in Angola.
And when we look at our milk index valuation, the Kenyan shilling stands out as the only currency right now that is slightly undervalued. Why is that the case?
Well, a combination of two things. As we saw last year, milk prices decreased a little bit at the same time where the Kenyan shilling actually depreciated. So the combination of that actually allowed for the Kenyan shilling to be about 1.5% undervalued, right? Which is a bit of a rarity when it comes to Africa. So, looking forward in terms of what that means for the Kenyan shilling, we saw the authorities continue to draw down on their FX reserves to minimize volatility. And ultimately, we do think that valuation will probably sort of trend sideways for the remainder of this year, simply because the currency has already weakened. But on the horizon, of course, the global environment is still fraught with risks, and we have to be cognizant of that, and of course the impact that we're going to see specifically on the Kenyan shilling. But we do anticipate that there will be a little bit of weakness as we get to the tail end of this year. Of course, corporates are going to be demanding dollars in order to stock up the shelves for the festive season. So that in itself is going to have some impact in terms of valuation of the Kenyan shilling.
When you look at your crystal ball as an analyst, what would your 18 months outlook look like for global currencies, or rather African currencies as a whole?
I wish I had a very clear crystal ball. Otherwise, I'll be sitting in the Bahamas somewhere. But I think, if we just look at, what's coming on the horizon, right? If we look at the US dollar, that is bound to be strengthening as the Fed, starts tapering. And that in itself is going to have some impact in terms of local currencies, where, of course, on the other end of the spectrum, we're going to see local currencies come under pressure a little bit. So as I intimated around Kenya, in terms of the demand for dollars as you get into the year end, that is going to be prevalent across most of the African currencies. So that in itself, I think, should result in a little bit of pressure on the currencies themselves as you get into the festive season. But I think we also have to be cognizant that central bankers are going to be mindful of that pressure, and that in itself is going to at least force them to some degree to be able to actually start drawing down on their FX reserves to try and mitigate that volatility and the weakness that is going to be subsequently coming. So I think there are those factors that has to be taken into consideration. But by and large, I think the global environment is probably a little bit more forgiving, as it were, on African currency. So, potentially as we sit here this time next year, obviously talking about the next update, I would imagine that, there will be, a little bit of increase in terms of overvaluation, but I don't expect crazy moves, as it were.